Just across the English border into Scotland, there's a building called Abbotsford. It's a home, it's a mansion. And over the centuries, it has been a home to rich and famous and important people. But of course, Abbotsford was built in the early 1800s, and the whole area had been settled by people for many, many centuries before that. It was always on a border, and so that area, well, it had the usual strife and feuds that are common to border areas. But this is a story that happened in the year 1611. It's a legend and a story that was immortalized in a poem by the poet Robert Browning. In the early 1600s, in those borderlands, there were two families who always seemed to be warring with each other. There was Wat Scott of Hardin and Gideon Murray of Elibank. They were the leaders of their respective families, and they were known as border reivers. They were always stealing from each other, cattle especially, sheep, but really anything that they could get their hands on. There was skirmish after skirmish, there was bloodshed, and there was death. Now, when Queen Elizabeth I died, and King James I of England, James VI of Scotland, became the ruling monarch, he decided that it was definitely time to put a damper on these activities. So he let it be known that anyone who was caught stealing cattle would simply be hanged at once. No trial, no questions asked. And that is exactly what would have happened to young Wat, young William Scott, except that Gideon Murray didn't want it to be a quick and anonymous hanging. He had other ideas in mind. Now I have to tell you about the Murrays. Gideon Murray and his wife, a beautiful Lady Murray, they had several children, all daughters, and the daughters had married well, all except the youngest. Her name was Agnes, but people called her Meg, and it's sad to say, lots of people called her Muckle-Mouth Meg. Muckle meaning big, and some people said that they called her Muckle-Mouth Meg because she simply said what she wanted to say, whenever she wanted to say it. She was girlish and she was frank. But other people said that it was not as metaphorical as that. She had a big mouth, a mouth that seemed to stretch from one ear to the other and really marred her beauty. And because of this, people often made fun of her, and a lot of people whispered that they couldn't imagine that anyone would agree to marry such an ugly woman. Well, back to the cattle stealing. In that time, young Wat Scott, who was the heir to his family, he was young, he was strong, he was handsome, he was popular, he had a lot of friends, and he decided that it was time to gather his friends up and go on a reaving party and steal the cattle from Gideon Murray. But unfortunately for young Wat, Gideon Murray had been tipped off as to what they had planned, and so his men were waiting for the reavers. And there was fighting, there was bloodshed, and in the end, young Wat was captured. He was tied up, and he was taken back to Gideon Murray's castle, where he was thrown unceremoniously into a dark, dank dungeon. Well, young Wat, he knew what his fate would be, hanging, and he was preparing himself for that death with dignity and pride. So the next morning he was hauled out of the dungeon, where he faced Gideon Murray, but also a noose, and also Lady Murray and a crowd of people. Because since Gideon Murray wanted to discourage people from stealing his cattle, he had simply alerted all of his friends and relatives and neighbors to come and watch that hanging. Nothing like a hanging, he thought, to really let people know that they shouldn't be stealing his cattle. That's exactly what would have happened if it hadn't been for Lady Murray. She stood there and she saw young Wat. He was young, as I said, and handsome and strong. And there was the noose. And Lady Murray thought it would be a terrible pity, what a waste, to have such a young man die so young, when perhaps he could be of use in other ways. And so she whispered to her husband. He shook his head vigorously, no. But she whispered to him again, and again he shook his head, no. But Lady Murray was persistent, and finally Gideon shrugged and nodded. And so he faced young Wat, and he said, as you know, you are to be hanged today. But now I ask you, would you choose life over death? Well, young Wat was surprised. Of course, he said, of course I would choose life rather than death. Do I have such a choice? And Gideon Murray said, you do. You can choose to die by hanging here and now, or, everyone waited for the or you can marry my daughter Agnes. Young Wat looked momentarily confused. Agnes? He said, you mean Meg? You mean Muckle-Mouth Meg? I should marry her? Yes, said Gideon Murray. Yes. Well, to be honest, young Wat had never met or even seen Meg, but he had heard about her, and he had heard what people said about her. He was having none of that. He said, yes, I would choose death over marriage to a frog-mouthed woman. Well, Gideon Murray said, well, then you shall die now. But Lady Murray again whispered to her husband, and Gideon Murray said, I'll give you a week to think over your choices. Back to the dungeon you go. And then he announced to the crowd that they should come back in a week for a hanging or a wedding. And the crowd dispersed. Well, young Wat was lying there in the dungeon. Gideon Murray didn't want it to be a pleasant week, not exactly a vacation. He said he can have water, but no food. It'll give him a chance to think. But that night, under cover of darkness, the door of the dungeon opened, and someone came in. It was too dark for young Wat to see who it was, but he heard the swish of skirts, and he smelled the fragrance of roses, and something else, too. He smelled food. And so it was that a woman, unknown to him, delivered a tray of food. She spoke to him kindly. Later he said it was like the voice of a lark. And when she handed him the food, he felt her soft hands. Well, this scene repeated itself every night for the rest of the week. And when 7 days had passed, young Wat was again hauled up in front of Gideon Murray and a crowd of onlookers and a noose. And once again Gideon Murray said, and so I hope you've had a chance to consider your choice, life or death. Well, young Wat straightened his shoulders and he said, I choose death rather to be married to a wild-mouthed monster. Well, if that's your choice, that's what it will be, said Gideon Murray. But just then there was a voice that came from the back of the crowd, a voice like the voice of a lark. Would you marry me then, if you had the choice? Well, young Wat recognized that voice. It was the voice of the one who had brought him food every night that week, and he said, well, of course I would marry you if I have that choice. And then a young woman stepped to the front of the crowd and said, and am I not the very same Muckle-Mouth Meg? Well, the crowd gasped and then chuckled, and young Wat was momentarily confused, but he said, Meg? And then if you had been there, you would have said that the next thing that happened was that you wouldn't have been able to see that famous Muckle-Mouth because it was completely covered by a long and very enthusiastic kiss. And so it was that young William Scott, young Wat, and Agnes Muckle-Mouth Meg were married. The marriage agreement was signed that very day. Nobody had parchment, but it seems that they wrote down the marriage agreement on the head of a drum that had been there to mark the death of young Watt, and now had a very, very different thing to do in this story. Well, so it was that William Scott and Agnes Murray were married, and they made their home there on the borderland. And by all accounts, it was a very, very successful and happy marriage. They had 8 children, and as the years passed, grandchildren and great-grandchildren and many, many great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. And so a couple of of years later, a house, Abbotsford, was built in that spot, and it was the home of the famous Sir Walter Scott. A story of Muckle-Mouth Meg, a story from the Scottish borderlands.